Jumanji and Zathura are both film adaptations of novels written by Chris Van Allsburg about board games that try to kill you. When I was younger, I was always conflicted on which of these films I prefer, and I feel like you can make a pretty compelling argument for both of them. For instance, where Zathura tells an engaging and dynamic story about a spot-on portrayal of two siblings learning to get along, Jumanji has Robin Williams. In all seriousness, it's been years since I've watched either of these films, so I figured it'd be interesting to rewatch them and finally give my younger self some closure on this question. And you know, I learned some pretty interesting things about both of them. It should be said that, despite the very similar premises these films both hold, as well as some of the obvious parallels between the two, like how they're both about two siblings, how there's a third character who gets introduced who's been stranded for years from playing the same board game, the movies are still very different. Zathura is a much more sedentary movie. Most of it is spent in the house with a much more claustrophobic feel to it. It's also much darker, both visually and tonally, but I'll get to that later. Jumanji, on the other hand, is all over the place, both visually and tonally. Something that shocked me when rewatching Jumanji was just how much of a prominent emotional side it has. When rewatching these two movies, I was expecting Zathura to be the slightly darker, slightly more mature one, and Jumanji to be more of just a fun film. And while, yes, it is, it can also get super melodramatic, particularly in the first act. There are so many somber and heartwarming moments crammed into the first act, like where they're laying in bed all, "Do you miss mom and dad?" or when Robin Williams shows up and you think the movie's gonna start being fun now, but then they decide to dedicate time to showing how long he's been trapped in the board game and how everything has changed. Not saying that that's a bad thing or that this is a particular aspect that shouldn't have been focused on, I'm just saying there's none of this in Zathura, like practically none. It's sort of weird in that regard. I mean, the astronaut is revealed at the end of the movie to have actually been Walter, showing a sort of what could have been scenario with their sibling rivalry, yet despite this, there is no "I'm home" scene with this guy. Probably so they could hide the reveal. The other big aspect of Jumanji was the fact that the two kids' parents died. That's like its main thing. The thing they want to bring up whenever it's time to get emotional. Zathura's thing is the fact that the two kids' parents are divorced. But where Jumanji feels the need to constantly remind us of the fact the kids' parents are dead, Zathura is pretty light on the whole divorce thing. They make it clear pretty quickly in the first act and then move on, continuing with a more comedic tone, focusing more on showing the two brothers argue and piss each other off. The sibling relationship aspect of Zathura is where the film gets me most. Seriously, the interactions between Danny and Walter are gold, especially in the first act, though it still continues throughout the rest of the movie. Without that element, I wouldn't have liked this movie nearly as much as I did. Unfortunately, Jumanji doesn't really have much of an equivalent. The two siblings don't really have much of a rivalry or any particular conflict in their relationship. The movie is much more focused on Robin Williams, it seems. Even with Robin Williams, it wasn't really quite enough to carry the film for me in the same way that the sibling rivalry in Zathura does. In fact, most of the comedy in Jumanji is less dialogue-based and more focused on slapstick/character reactions. With Robin Williams being the major comedic aspect of the movie, he's also the most interesting part as well. The two siblings are pretty boring and don't do a whole lot for me. They each have one quirk, and then that's like their whole personality. Judy lies a lot, Peter only talks to his sister and no one else, that's it. Then you have the fact that their parents are dead. The film sort of relies on this to make them more interesting. It doesn't. Then again, with the way this film's first act is structured, it was kind of already pretty difficult for them to try and make me care about the two siblings anyway. Have I mentioned how oddly paced this movie is? It opens up with a pretty unnecessary prologue in the 19th century showing these two kids burying the game. Did they seriously think they need to explain why the game is buried, as if the viewer is going to be wondering, hey, how did that board game get there, when Alan finds it? It's more to set up intrigue, but there's kind of already a decent amount of it anyways, with the drums and everything when Alan finds it. After that prologue, it cuts to 1969, and you think, okay, now the movie's starting. We get a pretty clean first act, establishing Alan's struggle with the bullies, his relationship with his dad, etc. I'm invested. He finds the board game, you think, alright, here we go, Jumanji, now here's where the movie starts. And he's playing the game with Sarah, and it's like, alright, time for Jumanji. And then it's just, what's going on? Then they hit you with the 20 years later, and it's like, oh god damn it, you're telling me that was a second prologue? Seriously, why the hell are there two prologues? And why is the second one structured like a movie? It's weird. They spend all this time making me care about Alan in the first act, then they do a time skip and suddenly the film shifts focus to these other two kids and we get like a large sum of time dedicated to setting their struggles up, and it's like so hard to care about them because the movie just spent all this time making me care about Alan. Compare this to the first act of Zathura, and really it's no contest. Zathura is clean, simple, and to the point. There isn't a weird, dramatic opening where the original owners of the house put away Zathura and say, "May God have mercy on their soul," when asked what happens if somebody decides to play. They focus on just the two kids, and it works. It works really well. Something I noticed here too, they really try to play up how the kids don't really like their father's house because it's old and creepy or whatever. But like, it looks super nice. I mean, I wish I had a house this nice and spacious. Funny story, my friend who moved into America around 5 or so years ago said that when he watched this movie as a kid, he thought that all the houses in America were like this, and so when he was moving here, he was super excited to see their house, but it just turned out to be a small, crummy apartment. Anyways, we then get a smooth transition into the inciting moment where the kids finally play the board game, and thus begins the second act, which is where the film kind of dips in enjoyment for me, just a little bit. In a way, the structure of these two films are sort of like opposites. The first act of Jumanji is long, clumsy, and dramatic. The first act of Zathura is short, efficient, and entertaining. The second act of Jumanji is fun, bright, and has a lot of visual variety. And then the second act of Zathura is dramatic, dark, and only really has one setting. Let me clarify by saying that I don't think that the second act of Zathura is nearly as bad as the first act of Jumanji. I mean, the first act of Jumanji takes 40 minutes to be over. That's 40 minutes of setup. The movie literally doesn't properly start for 40 minutes. Regardless, Zathura just loses a lot of the fun for me. Everything is dark, most of the threats created by the game are legitimately threatening, the siblings arguing gets downplayed a bit. Then you have Jumanji, which downplays the siblings as well, though I feel that's a good thing because we get more of Alan and Sarah, who are pretty fun to watch interact, even if I kind of roll my eyes at the whole romantic subplot thing they got going on. At this point, I can't even tell who the protagonist is supposed to be. I think it's Alan? I don't know, that whole thing with the two prologues threw everything off. In this regard, Zathura is the overall more competent film here. Danny's the protagonist, his motivation is wanting to be treated well by his brother, it's very to the point, and all his actions line up with this. It's here I continue to feel conflicted, because what's more important, competency or fun? Jumanji is a funner movie, but it bites off more than it can chew. Look at all the plots they have going on here. Alan standing up to the bullies, Alan's relationship with his father, the romantic subplot, Judy's pathological lying, Peter not talking, the siblings dealing with the loss of their parents, and the siblings' poor relationship with Nora. Out of all these conflicts, the only ones that really get a proper conclusion are Alan's. Alan learns to stand up for himself, like last second during the climax. Alan and Sarah end up getting together, which like, okay, and that's about it. Well, okay, Peter does end up talking, but it's resolved so quickly and anticlimactically in the first act that I hardly consider that to even be a real conflict. And the parents dying thing ends up straight up being prevented because once the game is over, Alan and Sarah return to the 60s and eventually end up meeting Peter and Judy's parents and tell them not to do the thing that ends up getting them killed. Imagine being a kid watching this movie whose parents died and actually finding Judy and Peter relatable due to the similar circumstances and finding overall comfort in knowing that your experiences are shared, but then they just get a happy, it never happened ending. So you have Jumanji, which creates way too many character conflicts and barely manages to resolve even a few of them last minute, and then you have Zathura, which, while having a pretty basic conflict of two brothers learning to get along, manages to bite off just enough to properly conclude everything. But then again, it's at the cost of just not being as fun of a movie as Jumanji. Which, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the movie is devoid of fun during the second act, not at all. It has its moments, the odd wisecrack or two, occasional jokes, it certainly isn't boring, but it is a bit tiring. I also find it lacks a lot of small things, bits of extra spice to truly make it memorable. For instance, in Jumanji's case, they have the benefit of being on Earth, and so a large part of the enjoyment of that movie is seeing all the crazy stuff the board game conjures up causing mayhem throughout the town, seeing people react to all the crazy stuff going on. The closest thing that Zathura has to this is the 5 turns the older sister spends frozen, wondering what her reaction is going to be to everything going on after she's unfrozen. After that, there really isn't much else to look forward to, except maybe getting to see what the Zorgons look like. I'm not saying that it should have been on Earth and that we should have gotten to see more reactions from people, because let's face it, then the movie really would just be a clone of Jumanji. I just feel it lacks little things that would help it build a better tone and break up some of the monotony. Jumanji sorta wins here. Speaking of Jumanji, let's talk about Jumanji. The board game, that is. It's a simple, luck-based, race-to-the-end type game. Roll the dice, move the piece, first one to the end wins. However, the big gimmick of this film in Zathura is the fact that, upon each dice roll, the game will conjure up some type of obstacle related to the game's theme. For Jumanji, it's something jungle-related. For Zathura, it's something space-related. Once one piece reaches the end, everything is reset. Simple, easy to follow, and can be used to lead to some pretty interesting dilemmas. Though there is a big difference in how each of these films portrays the creations of the board game. In Jumanji, there are a fair amount of things that do serve as a legitimately scary threat. A lot of them only feel like threats in the same way that a giant hammer is a threat in a squash and stretch cartoon. You understand that there's danger, but not enough for it to really feel intense, keeping in line with the film's light tone. The creations in Zathura, however, are straight about to kill these kids. You have this giant freaking robot with saw blades, the sun here to incinerate the kids, space pirates that are outright destroying the house in fleets. It's pretty intense. And unlike Jumanji, there aren't a whole lot of places for these kids to run. It all really depends on what your cup of tea is. Do you want something that's intense or something that's fun? I feel that Zathura capitalizes more on the board game aspect. See, in Jumanji, it doesn't really matter who gets to the end first, as long as one of the pizzas... Pizza... I wonder if this has anything to do with the fact I just had Papa John's. There is no competition here. No one really cares who gets to the end first, and so I feel you could substitute the board game motif with anything else, and the story would still work just the same. Having it be a board game makes it a little easier, though, as it prevents a clear-cut way to resolve everything. Just have a piece reach the end. In Zathura, however, the main conflict of the whole movie revolves around the fact that Walter seems to be better than Danny at everything. Danny expresses this very early on in the movie. We also see that Walter doesn't really want anything to do with his little brother. After their dad leaves for work, Danny does try to get his brother to play with him, showing that he does still care about Walter. He doesn't completely hate him or anything, but Walter doesn't feel the same. Walter doesn't want to play with Danny, claiming that he's grown up. So with all of this clearly set up in the first act, it's thematically fitting that the thing that forces these two to work together would be a board game. Not only are the two finally playing a game together, but it's a competition, and a competition we all want Danny to win here. Zathura in this regard is a film that is more concerned than Jumanji is with setting things up and having them pay off later. It's a very tightly knit film, making sure that everything that the board game conjures up is used to its fullest potential. You have the robot, which is established to belong to Walter but has malfunctioned. The fact that the Zorgons are attracted to fire. The girl being frozen for 5 turns, ensuring that she doesn't learn all the same key plot stuff the kids learned, immediately leading to major conflict. Jumanji is a much more loosely strung along film. It's fast, frantic, constantly bringing out new things from the board, bringing them back occasionally for fun callbacks and jokes, but not a whole lot else. The closest thing we get to having something set up and then brought back later is when the plant eats the police car, preventing Nora from getting back home so that there's enough time for the characters to finish the game without her seeing what a mess the house has become. I suppose that there's also the Hunter, aka the film's primary antagonist. Each of these films has a major recurring villain. In Jumanji, it's the Hunter, and in Zathura, it's the Zorgons. The Hunter, you'd think, would be pretty threatening, seeing how he straight up uses a gun, but most of the time he misses easy shots and is overall more played for laughs. His presence in the film has less significance as a threat and more in a thematic sense. The Hunter is meant to be Alan's father, hence why the riddle the game presents says that he'll make you feel like a child, alluding both to fear and the fact that the Hunter will essentially be the father or mother, who knows, of the person who rolled. It's a pretty clever way to have Alan get some conflict with his father and develop on their relationship, seeing how his dad is dead, though it feels a bit poorly thought out as to what they wanted the conflict between him and his father to be. It's not like Alan learns to appreciate his dad more. It's not like his dad learns not to be an asshole. Well, I mean, he does, but not because of anything related to the stuff that happened during the movie. I guess it's meant to be more about Alan standing up for himself. You're telling me he spent 26 years in the jungle and is still a coward? And if that's what the conflict was meant to be, wouldn't it have made more sense thematically for the Hunter to have been one of the bullies? They're the ones Alan was afraid of during his childhood, after all. It's not like Alan ever had a problem standing up to his dad. He literally argues with him at the beginning of the movie. Now, the Zorgons are not like the Hunter. They won't exercise restraint because they are children. They will kill them if they get the chance. Danny and Walter cannot give them that chance. The Zorgons are interesting because you don't really see them for most of the movie, just their ship. In that regard, it does a good job at setting up some intrigue. During their first appearance, they create some tension, do some damage, and overall leave enough of an impression to be intimidating, while also leaving enough missing as to create a bit of anticipation for their next arrival. The way that they're dealt with is pretty simple. Basically, the Zorkons are attracted to heat, as they like to burn things, so basically everything in the house that generates said heat must be turned off to keep off of the radar. After that, it's as simple as luring them away with a couch set on fire. This is also what I mentioned earlier about how this film does a better job at setting things up and having them either pay off or create consequences later. The film makes it very clear on what will attract the Zorgons and what their overall motive is. Burn shit and eat people. There's also the sister who factors into the Zorgons as a threat. The film very deliberately has her frozen for 5 turns so that when the characters learn not to turn on the heat in the house, she isn't present to know as well. So when she is eventually unfrozen, the very first thing she does is complain about how cold it is and then turn up the heat, instilling an immediate gut reaction of, oh no, in the audience. This is just another example of Zathura being an overall more intense movie. The Hunter, despite using a gun, isn't typically very threatening. It's threatening in the same way that Elmer Fudd using a gun is threatening. I like his design, his personality, and his overall demeanor, how he uses all these old-timey curse words like blast, but his appearances are often left more to coincidence. He never finds the characters because they leave behind some kind of accidental hint to their whereabouts, giving the Hunter some sort of lead. He just shows up occasionally so he can shoot and miss all his shots. Again, with the Zorkons, every time they appear, they have a good reason to, like their second appearance, which is again the result of proper setup and build-up. It's during the Zorgon's second appearance that we actually get to see what they look like, and quite honestly, they do not live up to the expectations. They're just sort of these bland-looking, generic lizard monsters. They don't even look threatening, their movements are clunky and slow, they look more like one of those bad costumes from the old Power Rangers. This is where the Hunter actually wins for me. I like his overall presence in Jumanji more than I do the Zorgons. The Zorgons, while threatening, are pretty boring for me, but the Hunter I actually found memorable. It's during the Zorgon's second and major appearance that we also get some more payoff to the stuff that was previously set up. At the beginning of the movie, it was established that Danny is terrified of the basement, as most kids his age are, so it was a pretty clever callback how for the climax of the movie, not only does he need to enter the basement to retrieve the board game, being the only one small enough to fit, but now he's in actual danger due to the fact that the Zorgons are down there. It's an interesting way to show not only how he's changed throughout the movie, but also to tie back into his whole rivalry thing with Walter, because now, for once, he's doing something that Walter can't, and in the end, is the one who pretty much saves the day. This isn't really the most original premise, though. The underdog being the one who saves the day isn't exactly new, but still, this movie found pretty clever ways to convey this, ways that feel grounded and realistic. It is definitely more of a movie about execution rather than originality. The Zorgons end up being defeated by the robot from earlier after the kids finally realize what the reprogram card from earlier was for. It's before the game ends, Walter uses his wishing card for something a little more selfless than what the Walter we knew from the beginning of the movie would have wished for. He wishes for the astronaut to have his brother back, as it was established earlier that the astronaut played this game too as a kid and ended up wishing his brother away because of how much he hated him, forever leaving him stranded in space. It's here we find out that the astronaut was actually Walter from the future. The plot reveal more stands to show just how bad the two brothers' relationship was in hindsight, how Walter, in another reality where the astronaut didn't stop him, wished Danny out of existence. It's the little extra bit of cement this movie needed to really show just how much the two have grown in their relationship just before the film ends, with the game being complete and everything reset. I like the ending to Zathura better than the ending to Jumanji. Jumanji's ending, where nearly all the unresolved conflict just flat out gets deleted from existence, feels a bit lazy to me. Zathura's ending is just a lot cleaner and more satisfying, with the two major conflicts between the brothers getting a real resolution with the two finally getting along. Which again, is not even super original like I said. I firmly believe that Zathura is an execution film more than anything. It isn't about how much you like the ideas presented, but more so how well they're executed. Compare this to Jumanji and it's pretty much the opposite. Jumanji is more fun just for the original concept alone. It was pretty much the first movie to be based around something like this, a board game that tries to kill you, but then in the end, the execution ends up just being okay. It's because of this that years from now, Jumanji is always going to be remembered as the classic film. Regardless of execution, this will always be the film that people are going to show their kids and watch with their family. It's just that original. Zathura may have a clever twist on the premise, but despite its excellent execution, isn't going to be seen as the classic film here, which is a real shame because I enjoyed it a great deal. I firmly believe that these are both films that should be remembered as classics for what they brought to the table, but sadly, Zathura just isn't going to get as much recognition as its predecessor. In fact, I actually think I enjoyed Zathura more than Jumanji. These were both fun films, but I found Zathura's excellent execution was what did it for me. But don't get me wrong, Jumanji was great too, despite its many flaws. If you ever get the chance, I implore you to give both of these films a rewatch.